It was recently July 4th, American Independence Day. As you may know, America was previously a British colony, and after watching Hamilton, you might have been left a little confused as to why they hated that so much. I mean, George III seemed like a pretty fun guy, right? This is Chit Chat History, and welcome to another instalment of Unusual Taxes. Today I want to discuss the taxes placed specifically on the American colonies, eventually leading to the American Revolution, and how these taxes were a pretty legitimate thing to be angry about. The American colonies had been colonised by the British since 1607. Eventually, over the centuries, more and more people arrived as immigrants to the new land, and more people settled there, establishing towns, cities, and raising new generations of Americans. Eventually, 13 distinct regions or colonies were created. The population of American colonists boomed in the 18th century. The population in 1750 stood at 1.5 million. Britain's population stood at about 6 million in this time, so America was still a little smaller. However, in 1770, the economic output of these 13 American colonies made up about 40% of the British Empire, so not exactly unimportant. It is in 1754 that we see the start of the 7 Years' War. This was actually a European war that was fought on the North American continent between the European nations of England and France. The British and Americans often call this the French and Indian War because that was who they were fighting, although Native Americans were actually fighting on both sides of this conflict. Anyway, with this war, British presence and authority became more and more obvious to the colonists. Here started the tension between the British troops and officials and the American colonists. They were being treated as colonists, no longer really British citizens, but also no longer really living their life in their own little bubble. So we come to 1763. The British won the war over the French, but incurred a great amount of debt. The British argued that the colonists did not have a fair share of the burden in paying back these taxes, and the colonists believed that they'd paid enough with their lives fighting in this war for the British. This marks the beginning of extreme taxation and strangulation of the colonies. They began with the Sugar Act, increasing the duties on many goods imported and exported, specifically on sugar but also many other goods. The Currency Act, which prohibited the issue of any new bills, really assuming control of the colonial currency system. The Stamp Act, which I'll be talking a little bit more about later. The Townshend Act, which imposed taxes on British china, glass, lead, paint, paper and tea that was imported. The Tea Act, which was a tax on tea, leading to the infamous Boston Tea Party of 1773. And then the Intolerable Acts, which was limiting the self-government, punishing any defiance. Many of these new acts and proclamations are being discussed, debated and created in England, and just being implemented over in the 13 colonies. They called themselves Englishmen, were British citizens, and yet they had no voices for their own rights. But in England, they were seen as colonists, outsiders, those people across the sea that we can just tax for anything and everything. Also keep in mind that the colonists were no longer voting for members of parliament. No one was there to speak on their behalf or represent their region. And you may have heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. This is really where it makes its appearance, as colonists felt like they had no legal representation in the British Parliament. Now let's return to the Stamp Act. This required a stamp on all legal documents and printed materials. It was passed in 1765 without debate. Someone just said, hey, why don't we just make them pay for all the paper? And everyone said, yeah, great idea. They commissioned distributors who would collect the tax in exchange for stamping your paper. This included wills, deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards and birth certificates. So this literally affected every single person in the colonies who needed these very papers to live as citizens. Many colonists chose to boycott British goods to protest the Sugar Act. However, they couldn't simply avoid getting birth certificates or deeds to their houses. It is even said that this tax upon professional licenses and degrees specifically targeted the middle classes and would prevent a growth of academics and philosophers printing pamphlets of free thought and debate on the state of the colonies themselves. This tax faced huge resistance, understandably, and most colonists were already under huge economic strain because, if you remember, they did just have to deal with this massive war for 7 years. This was the first direct tax on the colonists, not just your average trade tax, so the colonists really felt like this, if anything, should have been something that Representative Assembly would have been debating on, not some guys across the ocean. Many of these taxes were created to either help pay debts incurred from the war or continue having British soldiers stationed in North America, neither of which the colonists really wanted or felt that they should be made to pay for. And in fact, many questioned why there would even be military stationed there when they had literally just beat France. The feeling was rising that perhaps it was the colonists themselves that these troops were there to subdue. Resistance initially came from messaging. Newspapers printed numerous complaints and pamphlets discussing this new act. John Adams wrote in his resolutions against the act, "We have called this a burdensome tax, because the duties are so numerous and so high, and the embarrassments to business in this infant, sparsely settled country so great, that it would be totally impossible for the people to subsist under it. If we had no controversy at all about the right and authority of imposing it, we further apprehend this tax to be unconstitutional. We have always understood it to be a grand and fundamental principle of the Constitution that no free man should be subject to any tax to which he has not given his own consent, in person or by proxy." The Stamp Act Congress was also created to write petitions to the king. Delegates from numerous colonies who agreed that this was ridiculous. Their petition actually affirmed their loyalty to the king, while simultaneously trying to point out that direct taxation should be done closer to home. But writing simply wasn't enough, and soon the mass populace had to take it into their own hands. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty, the same guys who would later throw the tea in the harbour, formed a mob to walk through the streets demanding an appeal. They actually targeted the stamp collector in Boston, Andrew Oliver, tormenting him with an effigy of himself and then ransacking his home. He did understandably resign. Similar circumstances can be seen across the colonies, and by 1766 most of the stamp collectors had resigned, and literally nobody wanted to take on that job. Mobs would also prevent the stamps themselves from entering the cities, let alone to get to the stamp collector himself. So even if people paid the tax, there would be no stamp to give out. Parliament also began to feel pressure from English merchants, who were finding it hard to continue trade with the colonies, when everyone was boycotting their goods in protest. Eventually the act was repealed, not a year after it was put into place. Was it really because they realised it was silly, or was it just because the mobs were making it really difficult to impose? Well, soon after it was repealed, the Parliament passed the Declaratory Act that states the King and Parliament have full legislative power over the colonies. Just as a little reminder that they still had the power to do what they wanted and to pass legalisation on whomever they wanted. So, don't think of this as a win, because we could totally do it again if we wanted. It is said that these acts and resistance to them were precursors to the very revolution itself. We see the colonies acting together, across borders and in unity against the force of the English nation. A Stamp Act Congress was formed to discuss the repression of the colonies, and was actually the first intercolonial congress to meet in America. Mobs were formed in aggression against such treatment, and forms of violence against those who represented this act and British authority. This really was the beginning of the important us versus them mentality that fanned the sparks of the American Revolution. Now let me know what you think of these unusual taxes below in the comments, and make sure to check out my other video on window taxes. Now, do you think that Britain was more mad about losing the colonies, or just that they had to figure out how to get out of debt on their own? Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.